Ferrari has announced a replacement to the very popular 812 Superfast GT car. And the replacement is certainly interesting, not just for its pronunciation, but for its design language and what they've decided to do with the powertrain. The car is called the Cilindri, and hopefully I didn't butcher that pronunciation too badly. It basically means 12-cylinder, i.e. the car does what it says on the tin. Now it comes in both coupe and spider forms. I think the spider looks attractive, but I'd probably personally buy the coupe. There was a naturally aspirated 6.5 litre V12 that makes around 820 horsepower. That's something that is a little bit surprising, because with all of these emission targets floating around, having a naturally aspirated V12, well, they are a bit of a dying breed, and many cars are moving towards some form of electrification. As we've seen with the Lamborghini Revuelto or the Aston Martin V12 itself, is it not a naturally aspirated engine that is going to be in the Vanquish? So Ferrari has made a rather bold decision here. Now it reportedly has a top speed of around 340 km per hour or 211 miles per hour. It also reportedly goes from 0 to 62 miles per hour or about 0 to 100 km per hour in 2.9 seconds, which is rather blisteringly fast. Although exactly how fast it goes in the real world, well, that remains to be seen. Now supposedly gear shifts are 30% faster than in the 812 Superfast, and it redlines at 9500 RPM. So it is a very fast car, and certainly no one is going to be wanting for speed in this vehicle. Now the maximum torque is around 5,000 pound-feet of torque, and that occurs at 7500 RPM. However, again, reportedly, more than 3/4 of this are available from 2500 RPM, which is great if, like me, you're in an inner city location and you've got stop-start traffic and you're really not going to be going that fast in day-to-day circumstances, but you do want to be able to accelerate in the inner city. So I think they've made a good decision there. Similarly, it has rear-wheel steering, which is going to be great for maneuverability. Now the car itself is marginally heavier than the 812. Now the 812 came in at about 1525 kilograms. However, the Cilindri is slightly heavier at about 1560 kilograms, which is accounted for due to larger wheels, the bonnet, the active aero, etc, etc. So it is a little bit heavier, but really not demonstrably so, and it's kind of made up for it with some of the other things. Now there's also some interesting design decisions that have been going on here, for example to try to maximize the sound and the resonance from the engine, particularly in the inner cabin, particularly given the sound limitations that are being imposed on the car. But I'm sure that many people will put an exhaust onto the vehicle, so that will probably get around a lot of the sound limitations that the Eurozone is trying to bring in. Now the design itself is probably one of the most striking aspects of the Cilindri. In particular, it has resonances of the 365 Daytona, which particularly comes about via the front lights and also the front design of the bonnet, with the black strip between the front lights. I think it's rather attractive and a very effective retro throwback. However, again, I'm sure it will be slightly polarizing, as most design decisions are, but I think it works quite well. It also can have a panoramic roof, which I would probably not elect to have because I don't particularly want the sunlight, so therefore there is a carbon fiber option, which I'm sure that many of the vampires among us will probably tick. Now the exterior styling, like I've said, is quite attractive, at least in my opinion, and I've noticed it's been reasonably well received. I think it's an improvement over the 812, and that in large part is because I thought the 812 somehow felt a little bit busy, at least in my opinion. I think that the Cilindri looks a lot more interesting, and I also think it is a lot more straightforward and, I'll go with, elegant, so to speak. It's certainly been streamlined and looks a lot less fussy than the 812. Similarly with the rear of the car, it looks a little bit less fussy, but the 812's rear was already quite good. It's been streamlined in some aspects, and for example the rear taillights, well, they're now relatively thin strips as opposed to the round ones on the 812. But overall, I think it is an attractive car. I think it's an improvement in many areas, and I like the design language. I like the curves that are featuring throughout the Cilindri, and I like the front design of the bonnet. I also like the fact that you don't have too many aggressive aero intakes, which might have otherwise made the car looked like it was either trying too hard to be aggressive, looking a little bit over the top or overstyled, and just looking a little bit busy. I prefer the appearance of it, for example, to the Lamborghini Revuelto, which I think has too much going on at the front of the vehicle. And I don't particularly like the front of the Revuelto, not that I'm really in a position to be buying either of these cars at this point in time. If I had one criticism of the design language, is that there isn't really, to my mind, something tying together all of Ferrari's current lineup. For example, you've got the Roma, then you've got the Purosangue, then you've got the Cilindri, then you've got the 296. And they all have slightly different design language, and I'm not quite sure that I'm getting a common thread going throughout them. Now, they do have rather a smooth, kind of elegant type design language, but it's not like there's one particularly unique thing that is really telling you this is a Ferrari per se. You compare this with Lamborghini, where its angular design language appears to be very consistent across a lot of its models, and it is easily identifiable. I think Ferrari could potentially benefit from working on that, although maybe you might think that I'm off base there. Now, the interior of the Cilindri is reminiscent of the Purosangue and also modern Ferraris like the 296. The passenger can have a screen to stave off boredom in case, for example, the driver is waffling on, like I am in this video. The center entertainment system is, well, perfectly adequate and it's pleasant enough. I suspect that no one really cares that much about it when you're buying a car like this. The driver also has a screen gauge cluster. I personally prefer actual analog, sort of mechanical type gauges myself, but clearly they're a thing of the past and aren't going to be coming back. So I think reminiscing about those isn't really going to make any difference here. Now, there are some obvious comparisons to other vehicles. For example, you've got the Aston Martin Vanquish, which is coming out, which is going to have a V12 as well, with approximately the same amount of horsepower. I suspect that people aren't going to be cross-shopping between the Aston Martin and the Cilindri. I suspect that they'll be at very different price points effectively, and I also suspect that the Ferrari buyers aren't really going to be going for the Aston Martin instead. I also suspect that the Ferrari is going to hold value rather better than the Aston Martin. Probably the other V12 that is in this segment to some extent is the Lamborghini Revuelto, but of course, it's quite a different vehicle. For example, the Cilindri has the engine in the front and is a naturally aspirated V12, whereas the Revuelto has the engine in the back and is an electrically assisted V12 that has 3 other engines. So therefore, the two are very different vehicles. Now, I prefer the design language of the Cilindri, but I do quite like that the Revuelto has a clear tie into what Lamborghinis are like as vehicles. So like the coherence with the rest of the lineup, even if I specifically prefer this particular car over the Revuelto. I also strongly prefer the interior of the Cilindri over the Revuelto, which I think is just too busy and a little bit over the top and there's too much going on. I prefer the restrained elegance of the Ferrari interior over that of the Lamborghini. One other aspect of the Cilindri that I strongly prefer is that it is a naturally aspirated V12 and it has no hybrid component to it. Now, I'm sure that some people do like plug-in hybrids. I'm sure that some people do like the instant acceleration you get from some of the electric motors. However, I also have big question marks over the maintenance and reliability of some of those hybrid motors. I have big question marks over what happens to batteries as they start to degrade over time. For example, how much is it going to cost to replace the battery in a Revuelto? How much is it going to cost to service and maintain the hybrid engines? What are the maintenance costs in the real world of the Revuelto really going to be? Now, perhaps there'll be a pleasant surprise. Perhaps everything will be very reliable. Perhaps the batteries will have an incredibly long life, and when you need to replace them, they won't be too expensive to replace, and maintenance will actually be pleasantly surprising. However, I have concerns about how expensive that will be, particularly given how integral the batteries are to the weight distribution, which might make them a slightly tricky item to service, replace, and maintain. By contrast, the Cilindri might be a little bit easier given that it has only a naturally aspirated V12, so while things can still go wrong, and while Lamborghini's reliability has traditionally been better than that of Ferrari, it seems like it might be easier to take care of, and there might be less that will go wrong, and you won't need to worry about batteries and electric engines. But at least that's my views on it. Let me know your thoughts about the Ferrari offering, whether the Ferrari 12 Cilindri is a good move, whether it's an improvement, whether it's just more of the same, or whether Ferrari should have gone out on a limb and done something completely different. Let me know what you think about this car in the comments below.